Finding rock-solid hope when living with loss. Facing death is one thing, and yet living with the loss is quite another. And this YouTube series and the book, All About Grief, is shared with the hope that we can help everybody navigate their way through the inevitable journey from death through grief and mourning, and into that journey some practical thoughts and some dependable scriptures, bringing comfort to those who mourn and equipping those who care. To make sure you don't miss an episode, please do hit the subscribe button to join our community, and feel free to comment, supporting one another or asking questions as we navigate the journey of grief together. Most of you will have heard our story already, so let me summarize in brief. Our family had to watch Joel, our precious, previously very healthy son, in his absolute prime, reduced to a man often in excruciating pain, receiving brutal interventions, battered and bruised and scarred from those treatments and from those interventions. And I'll never forget the evening before he died. At Joel's request, we sat with him while the oncology consultant told Joel that the medical team had decided to withdraw any further treatment or support and were going to allow him to die. The following day at 12:57, with the whole family around him, Joel took his last breath. From the initial shock of the doctor's final pronouncement, 17 life-changing, exhausting days later, and Joel was safe in the arms of Jesus. But after Joel died, as you can imagine, there was a whole range of extreme emotions, and they were off the scale different to anything I had ever experienced before. Sharp shards of white-hot pain that unbidden would pierce the innermost recesses of my soul. At times they would cause involuntary howls of grief. At other times, the silence, the emptiness, the loss of all the dreams, all the plans, and above it all, the loss of someone who loved us so deeply and who we loved like crazy. It's 7 years on now. We've had the unwelcome honor and privilege of being initiated as members into the club that no one wants to join. Walking with God through suffering, death, dying, grief, and mourning, and in it all, discovering God's hand, God's ways, and God's compassion. Grief is a universal experience, and with the loss of a partner, a parent, a child, or a friend, the impact is profound and deeply personal. Yet, for an experience apparently so common, it can be incredibly lonely. People often don't know what to say. The world around you seems to move on while your own world has stopped. And faith at times can feel so desperately fragile. Others want you to move on. They want to fix the pain. It's understandable, but it's unhelpful. It's well-meaning, but it's hurtful. So therefore, it's encouraging and illuminating to look at grief and mourning from a biblical perspective. The challenge after death is the journey of grief and mourning. Jewish writer David Kessler says the reality of death at some point in our lives doesn't diminish the pain and the grief, but it helps to see the pain and grief as a natural part of life, rather than an aberration that has to be hidden or denied. There's no shame in grief. It's part of what it means to be human, and now that I've experienced grievous loss, I understand life as incomplete without it. And my views are coloured inevitably by my own experience. When I was 21 years old, I nursed my dad until he went to be with the Lord. It was my first ever experience of death and my very first sight of a dead person, and that dead person was my dad. I'll never forget that moment because my mum and I had prayed fervently, others had prayed, they'd been fasting, and of course there was huge sadness and a parallel disappointment. Much later in life, we were able to ensure my mother was cared for until her peaceful death, and we nursed Jill's mother in her own home until she died. I tell you these stories because they influence my understanding of Jesus' words, as I'll make clear in a moment. The experience of these three deaths, all close, all family, were one thing, and the promised comfort of Jesus in Matthew in their setting was also one thing, but the death of my son Joel was on a different level, beyond the pain of anything I could have ever imagined. With Jill's mum and dad, and with my mum, there were tears, yes, but they were actually tinged with relief. And the intensity of mourning was light because they were all past their 70 years and 10, and they all wanted to go home. With Joel, it was really different. As I mentioned earlier, from the initial shock of the doctor's pronouncement, 17 life-changing, exhausting days later, and Joel was safe in the arms of Jesus. For Joel, of course, better by far, better than the best he'd ever experienced on earth, wonderful as his life was. It really is better by far, but, and it's a huge but, what about the pain and turbulence for those of us left behind? Joel was my best friend, a co-labourer in church, a co-labourer at work. We would sail together, enjoy wine together, do the great outdoors together. We would talk to each other on the phone every day, email every day, every day. The loss, of course, left us all reeling, and the levels of grief our family has been through is off the chart, off the scale, beyond anything we could ever have contemplated it. And by the way, yes, we do still feel it nearly 7 years on. As a family, each in our own unique and varied way, we've had to live with and learn to process the mental, the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual dimension of grief and mourning. And frankly, we were not only unprepared, we were actually ill-prepared for grief on this level. And as Jill and I were to subsequently discover, Christians all over the world that we've met and talked to often struggle to welcome grief and express grief. And the first notion to dispel then is that Christians shouldn't really grieve, or at least please don't grieve publicly or in our church where it can be seen, and definitely don't grieve around me. I exaggerate, or do I? Our experience is that there is a subtle discomfort in many charismatic and evangelical churches around people who grieve. And to give you a bit of evidence, let me cite All About Heaven evening events. We ran 29 of them, and there were people who came up, roughly 10% of every evening would come up to talk to us, not about heaven, but about their lost loved ones. And we discovered these were people who simply didn't feel safe to express their grief in a church setting. We've not been taught as a church on how to handle the discomfort that grief produces when others mourn. We've not been taught that grief is to be embraced or welcome. It's more likely as a church member then that grief is something intuitively we wish those who are grieving could move on from. And at the heart of this discomfort probably lies a well-known scripture written by the Apostle Paul, which says, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve." And in our minds we almost pause there, but it goes on to say that you may not grieve as others who do not have hope. Matthew McCulloch, writer, suggests this: it's crucial, first of all, to accept that grief is not only unavoidable, it's also appropriate for Christians. When Paul says he doesn't want his friends to grieve as those who have no hope, he doesn't say he doesn't want them to grieve. He's assuming grief. What matters to him is how they grieve. He wants them to grieve, but he wants them to grieve with hope and not without it. And let me be clear, folks, I really do believe those who die in faith are in a better place. And of course, their lives are worth celebrating. But precisely because those loved ones are precious to us, they're worth crying over too. And my encouragement is this: nowhere in Scripture does it suggest that God's comfort ends grief or removes grief. It's important we get this so that we can give ourselves, and as a church family or a natural family, give others space to grieve, knowing that they're safe with us. And more importantly, maybe, just maybe, we can learn what it is to be a conduit of comfort. So for all of us right now, whenever the day comes, and come it will, know that you have permission to mourn. You have God-given space to grieve, God-given expectation to grieve, God-given permission to grieve. Your tears and your pain are validated. For every one of us, at some stage in our lives, we will need to embrace this permission and this validation and be purveyors of this same permission and validation to others in our families and in our churches. Now, of course, there are different ways of handling different challenges at different seasons on the journey. Scripture helpfully tells us each heart knows its own grief. Our expression of grief is uniquely ours. I say that because it's important to know there's no one right way to grieve. It's important that you and I don't get pressurized into any particular choices or patterns of behavior that appear more spiritual or more godly. No. And it's also important that those of us who seek to care and love the bereaved understand this and encourage space, ooze encouragement and permission to grieve. Jill and I were in Ohio 2 weeks before recording this video, and we were talking about grief to a church, and a lady bought a copy of the book, and the person manning the resource table asked her if the talk had been helpful. Yes, she said. After 7 months as a widow, someone in the church told me to get over it and move on, quote unquote. She described her great relief as in that morning, listening to the content that you're hearing today, she said, I can see I have permission to grieve. As we'll discover from Scripture, sorrow and grief are to be expected and actually welcomed. Welcomed? Yes. If he's to heal the brokenhearted, then expect tears. If he's to heal the crushed in spirit, then expect tears. Tears can reflect real, deep, even unimaginable loss, and yet still carry with them the hope and certainty both about the destination of our loved one and our own future healing. It's poignantly helpful to know that. To make sure you don't miss future episodes, please do subscribe and feel free to join the community by chatting in the comments box or asking questions. Copies of the book, All About Grief, can be found at davidoliverbooks.com. The next episode shares an amazing discovery about grief that I think will have you excited, inspired, and filled with hope. And it has to do with how Jesus views grief.